Welcome to Secular Stories. I'm your host, David Orenstein, and today we're talking with Dr. Briana Pobiner and Dr. Isabelle Dervaux, two curators, about how the COVID-19 coronavirus has impacted museums and cultural institutions. Welcome back. So, by way of introduction, let me briefly explain to you the biographies of our two wonderful guests today. Dr. Briana Pobiner is a paleoanthropologist whose research focuses on the evolution of the human diet. She's done research in Indonesia, Kenya, Romania, Tanzania, and South Africa, and of course here in the United States. She joined the Smithsonian Institution in 2005 to curate and open the Hall of Human Origins. In addition to her ongoing research, she is also a professor of anthropology at George Washington University. Dr. Isabelle Dervaux is the curator and head of the Department of Modern and Contemporary Drawings at the Morgan Library and Museum. She holds a PhD in art history from the Institute of Fine Arts at New York University and a master's degree from the University of Paris at the Sorbonne. Before joining the Morgan in 2005, she was the curator of contemporary drawings and held curatorial positions at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. She is a scholar and has published extensively in many modern and contemporary art magazines and scholarly publications. So thank you both for joining today. Before we start and frame our conversation about life under COVID and where we might be in the tunnel of are we really leaving this behind yet or not? Could you talk about your life and work before the pandemic?
Well, it was, I guess, the typical work of a curator. I would go to the museum basically every day. But the work is not really sitting at the desk 9 to 5. It involves first spending time with the artworks in storage and things like that, but also going to see things in museums, meeting with colleagues, going to visit private collectors, and to see their collections, doing research in other libraries, all of that in the preparation of exhibitions or in planning for acquisitions. So it's, and then of course there is a social part in the evening, going to openings, dinners, etc., which sounds sometimes more glamorous than it is. But so this is important because this is obviously what will change with COVID. But so that's in a nutshell, that's how I was living.
So yeah, I would say something similar. My position at the museum, so like minor correction, I'm not a curator, although I did work on the curatorial team for the Hall of Human Origins. But my position, no, that's okay. My position straddles both doing research and outreach. And so for the research part, I could be traveling internationally pretty regularly, going to conferences and presenting papers, or studying collections, doing field work in other countries. And from the outreach part, I manage all of the public programs that are associated with the Hall of Human Origins. So we usually had a couple of public programs a month. I help with volunteer training for the public-facing volunteers in the exhibit. And I also help with online, helping keep our website up to date, which is the most visited website on human evolution, as well as social media accounts. And then I work more generally with larger education efforts at the Natural History Museum. So that could be helping put together other activities, helping with larger, broader volunteer training. I was also at the museum basically every day, attending meetings, once in a while going into the exhibit to make sure everything, was looking good. Yeah, I guess there was no such thing as a typical day, but that's part of why I liked it, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's an anthropologist and a former librarian and someone who just absolutely loves museums and volunteering for museums, a lot of the public misconception of what a curator does is, the idea of someone with like a bow tie on, just sitting in a dusty room, trying to figure things out. And you realize that the jobs that you both have are really people-focused jobs. I mean, they're jobs focused on things, but you couldn't do your job if you weren't connected to other people. We, of course, in higher education, as an administrator as well as a professor, we always make these contingency plans. But, it's like sitting on an airplane. Oftentimes we don't pay attention to the person saying buckle up and watch what happens, because you think you're going to make it, so you don't really pay attention to it. And I think a lot of times these contingency plans were in drawers gathering dust, themselves becoming artifacts, objects d'art. So when the pandemic hit, how gracefully were you moved out of your institutions?
The pandemic was something you only read about in books, in science fiction books, I think.
It was history.
So, yes,
Okay.
but I mean, I really doubt that, I don't know, but I really doubt that there was a specific plan for that. Certainly not in the employee's book that we get when we are hired.
Right.
But and it unfolded very quickly at first, as you know. We found out one day that we were closing the next day, and I think in some museums it was even the same day, because if I recall, it was on that Thursday, March 12th, that we. I mean, in the previous days, it started. Some offices were starting to close, so it was something you were beginning to hear that, places were closing. But and the week before, they had the first sort of official thing we got was an email saying that all travel was canceled. So and several of us curators of drawings were about to go to Paris for the annual drawing fair that takes place, very important fair at the end of March in Paris, called the Salon du Dessin. So all of that was canceled. So that was the first sign, but we really had no idea we would also have to go work at home. So that, and I think on that Thursday, we heard the Met was closing that day, that evening, and the Whitney was going to close the next day, and finally the Morgan said we're also closing on Friday. And so we were told we didn't even have to come back on Friday. I did come back because I really needed to get, we didn't, although I think nobody had a sense that this would be for so long. We thought, oh, maybe it's for a few weeks or, but still, I went the Friday morning to gather all the papers I thought I might need to continue what I was working on, some books, etc. I went home with 3 bags of stuff, to work at home. So it was really, and then it took some time. 2 weeks later, we had our first Zoom all-staff meeting, which was really kind of tentative. And it's only, I think, by mid-April, but the Morgan may not be the fastest paced institution, but it's only around mid-April that really all meetings started to happen, sort of the way they had happened before, but now on Zoom or some sort of virtual meetings.
My experience was pretty similar, and I still remember that week in March of when we were starting to hear definitely travel was being canceled, and other institutions in the DC area were closing. Ironically, we had recently opened an exhibit on pandemics called Outbreak in the museum. So we did have some sense of at least how things had happened historically. But I would agree. I mean, I think we have fantastic kind of safety planning in the museum. I'm not sure anybody had really thought about an extended pandemic and how that would impact our work. I do remember that Friday. I was also, it just so happened that that week I was hosting 2 undergraduate students from my undergrad institution, from our college. They have an externship program, which is basically a job shadowing program. So I had these 2 students with me. They were on their spring break when all of this was starting to unfold. And I remember one of them saying, like, wow, we get a behind the scenes look at kind of how a big institution deals with this kind of crisis, and, which is true.
Right.
And I definitely, one of the things I remember, you know, I have also, because I take extended trips for research, sometimes I'll say, like, all right, I'm going to bring a bunch of stuff home and I won't be back to my office for several weeks. It definitely, I don't think any of us had the sense of how extended this would be. But that kind of, I'm going to pack up for a little while, wasn't completely foreign to me. But I did things like, when I went in, I was allowed to go into the museum a couple of weeks later on special permission to collect some data for a presentation I was giving at a conference. And I like rescued a couple of colleagues' plants in their office when it became clear that this was going to be an extended period of time. And and I remember, you know, instructions from our building management staff about like clearing food out and, you know, that sort of thing. And so there were, as we were starting to, you know, get instructions on closing, it was like, no, this might be at least a couple of week period of time. So we needed to plan for that.
Yeah, hindsight is 2020. I know in where I teach, it was like, okay, we're going to go to online learning, and the decision in CUNY was March 17th. All of CUNY is closing, and we received that notification a week before the 17th. And at that point, I told all my students, "That's it. We're not even waiting till the 17th. We're going," because they were all on Blackboard anyway. If you know anything about Blackboard, you know, that's the system that most colleges and universities use to remotely teach online. And so we just went full online. And then the question came, well, what are we going to do next semester and next semester? Because it was very ad hoc, because this was February, so it was 3 months. We figured, oh, by the summer, we'll be in better shape. And maybe that's what you guys were thinking also, or your institutions were thinking, we'll come back in the fall. Didn't happen. We'll come back in the spring. Didn't happen. We'll come back in the fall. Here we are again. another cycle around the sun, as I like to say. And here we still are. I mean, it shows, I think, certainly maybe a lack of planning, but also an individual resiliency that we're able to adapt, if you will, in a very Darwinian way to our environments that we're living through now. So what's work been like from your homes? I imagine you're both working primarily out of your homes at this point.
There was already something in place, which is that we could, before the pandemic, we could always access our server, the Morgan server, from home. There was a particular, you know, way to work remotely. So so that part existed already, so that we could do it when we are traveling or whatever. Everything having to do with security at the Morgan for the artworks, and they have tons of contingency plans for all sorts of crises. So obviously there was never any problem on that front. You know, it was all in place. What you do, even if all the staff goes working at home, there is always obviously core security staff, etc., etc. I decided to adopt a structure immediately and to keep a distinction between weekdays and weekends, and even more in way than before, so that it doesn't, so that everything does not become the same, you know. And so I was answering emails basically from 9 to 5 or 9 to 7, let's say, and not so much on the weekends, and try to separate. And I didn't leave the neighborhood, obviously, for something like 3 months. So I didn't take the subway or anything, but I would go take a walk. There is a park nearby. So almost every day I would go take a walk and sometimes with neighbors. So that was also bizarre, because, you know, I've lived for 20 years here. I've never never not left my neighborhood for several days in a row, and even less for 3 months. But work-wise, we all realized, I think, that basically 85% of what we do can be done from home.
That's sort of startling, isn't it, when you think about it, Yeah.
Yeah, I would agree. So even before COVID hit, I was routinely working from home 1 day a week, which was great. That used to be my day of no meetings, which was like the day to get all the work done. Not so much anymore, but so I will say I was impressed with the institution's ability to kind of pivot to doing remote work for a lot of people, not everyone. I mean, it's difficult, I think, for people who are working in collections and doing on-site work, and there have been some creative solutions to make sure that people in those positions are still being productive. But there was lots of training on how to use Zoom and Teams and the software that we were using to do all of our collaborative meetings. And I think a lot of us at the museum, also because we do so much traveling, we were used to being a little bit portable in that sense. And I really enjoy working from home. Most of the time I can be really productive. I'm also a parent, though, of a 9-year-old. And so that different aspect of work-life balance when my son's been doing online school at home. The beginning of the pandemic was really chaotic with like what school was happening or wasn't happening. And my husband teaches in higher education. He's a professor, so he was also pivoting to like all his classes being online. So it was very stressful, particularly in the beginning. But yeah, I have found the same thing, that a majority of my work can be done remotely, and I have shifted some of the research that I'm working on. Instead of doing visiting collections or going to do field work, it's, remember that review paper we talked about writing 3 years ago? Let's do that this year. So it's been a lot of kind of literature-based research. We had a great, I have a research team that I'm working with in Romania that we were supposed to go last summer back to study some more collections, but instead we were able to at least do a little bit of research by all collectively looking at photographs of fossils together and sort of making a little bit of progress, even though I'm like, I want to be able to pick that one up and turn it around and see what's on the other side. But we've just, we've had to be creative. And one thing I've been grateful for is that I'm in a mid-career position where I can shift to like work on some of the things that have been on the back burner for a while. And just my heart goes out to all the graduate students and postdocs and people who are on these doing really time-sensitive research. And so I think kind of in the academic world at large, that's been a big struggle.
I mean, that was actually sort of one of my next questions of like, what have let's say your colleagues up and down the organization, how have they adapted to the quote unquote new normal?
Yeah, I think the situation can be very different depending a little bit on your personality, but also on your family situation, because obviously we were all aware that those among my colleagues who have young children, for instance, it was extremely difficult, to adjust, and you had a crying baby during the Zoom meeting, and and also obviously depending on the type of work that you were doing, it was easier for curators to work from home. But the Morgan put in place, in fact, asked everybody if there were projects that could be worked on by people without a specialty in that particular domain, particular field. And so, for instance, some of the conservators who couldn't go to work, tweak drawings, were involved in projects having to do with cataloging or with bibliographical research. I mean, these kind of things. A great project that was developed during the pandemic is the transcriptions of the letters of the first director of the Morgan. It's just to make it very short, the first director of the Morgan, who was initially the assistant of J.P. Morgan, it was found out only about 20 years ago, was actually a very interesting woman who had a really interesting life. She was a Black woman who was even the daughter of a Black activist, but she passed as white. And wow. And it was only really established who she was about in the late 90s. And at any rate, there's a trove of letters that she wrote. She was a friend and at some time lover of Bernard Berenson, the famous art historian. And because he was living in Europe and she was living in the US, it was mostly by letters. And she, as a good archivist, destroyed all the letters that she had received from Bernard Berenson, knowing what would happen to them. Bernard Berenson kept her letters, and there are over 600 of them. And they are at Itati in Florence, his villa. And they, by really lucky, they were digitized just before the pandemic. And so a team of Morgan staff, led by a curator of manuscripts, started working on the transcription of these letters, because we are actually planning an exhibition around her for the centennial of the library in 2024. So that was an interesting, in a way, that was a good moment there, because there were members of the staff who were available since we couldn't work on site to work on those transcriptions. So this is just an example of how things have been happening.
So yeah, I have two examples that I can think of. One is another research example. So the director of the Human Origins Program, Rick Potts, who is the curator of our exhibit, normally goes to Kenya twice a year. And in the summer, it's usually a long fieldwork season for excavation. And so while he wasn't able to go, obviously in 2020 in the summer, he had a virtual field season where a lot of the expert excavators, a few of the expert excavators, and I've worked on this excavation for several years as well, went to the field and were able to we were worried about heavy rains having eroded some of the sediments, and we wanted to make sure that none of the fossils were, that anything was sort of rescued and secured. And so Rick was able to have video calls with the expert staff who were out there doing several days of field work and, sending photos back and forth. So he was able to kind of monitor and supervise a virtual field season, which I thought was a really creative way of at least, making sure that the elements hadn't done too much damage to the excavations. The other thing that I thought was just a heroic effort was that there was this very quick pivot by everybody in our Office of Education to delivering programs digitally. So school programs for adults, family programs, and it was an amazing effort. We had, dozens and dozens of programs in the spring after COVID hit. And that was also a great way for staff who had normally been doing other education outreach activities to help work on this effort, because it was the main way that we were engaging with the public. And then there was also digital summer camps in the summer. And so it was really amazing to see everybody pull together to be able to say, like, we're going to figure out how to do this. And we have some great expertise already with digital programs in our museum. So that was heartening. And I guess the third thing actually is that it came at a moment where the museum was also focusing on some internal work. So I'm the vice chair of the Idea or Diversity Council in the museum. And so we've spent a lot of time crafting a diversity plan, which we have just finalized and presented to the museum's board. We've also worked with the Smithsonian's research office to do a survey of perceptions of diversity among the staff. And then we also had a visiting committee, an external committee who was evaluating science broadly in the museum. And so that was a big undertaking that involved basically all the scientists, and our head of science, Rebecca Johnson, has been basically responding to the visiting committee. And now we have a series of task forces to think about how we move forward. So we've been able to, I guess that's the silver lining, is that sort of this pause has allowed us to do that kind of internal work in a sense.
So it's more than just even a reasonable facsimile, it's the work, but it's just moved from the physical to the virtual in some senses.
Exactly. And yeah,
we've come to the point where we can do an awful lot just in our pajamas. What, if anything, has been taken away? In other words, have programs been delayed? Have exhibitions been delayed? which would make sense because if you're a public institution and the public can't come, can you either of you talk about that? Anything that may have been, if not canceled, at least delayed until we're post-COVID?
Yeah, yeah, I mean, certainly in terms of programs, but I mean, I want to say also that the fact of not having direct contact with colleagues, either at the Morgan or at other institutions, is definitely something that's missing. I mean, yes, you can talk on the phone or you can have Zoom meetings, but it is definitely not the same. So I think that's certainly something that's missing. And in terms of programs, well, we had to cancel all the programs we do in the auditorium, concerts, lectures, and all. Some of it, of course, moved online. We also developed an important program, a series of programs online, and outreach that way. In terms of exhibitions, well, the problem was the exhibitions that were both at the Morgan and the other museum, the exhibitions that had just been installed and had barely opened and had to close. And in some cases, it was possible to reopen them in September, but not always. It's the case in modern art, famously with the Gerhard Richter exhibition of the Met, which was at the Met Breuer, which a huge, really, exhibition, which was open for 9 days. And they could not, so they had worked on it for 6 years or whatever, and the works were coming from all over the world. And because of the situation of the Breuer building going to the frick afterwards, they could not reopen it with the exhibition. They could not extend it, so that was a total loss. And I mean, except for the lucky ones who saw it during the only week that it was open.
That's like winning the lottery then, those 9 days. Yeah.
And otherwise, for us, it's been mostly shifting things, postponing. I was going to have an exhibition of the drawings of the Swiss artist Ferdinand Hodler, which was going to be in the summer. And because the works were coming from Switzerland, so obviously this had to be postponed. It's now in 2022 or maybe even 23, I don't remember. So there was a lot of shifting around. The Hockney, we were able to keep, we extended it. We were able to actually have it for 6 months instead of 3 months because we have reduced attendance, and so that would allow more people to see it. And by having longer exhibitions, you avoid all the problems of, the organizing, putting together other exhibitions, etc. So, we adopted a sort of slower pace that way to adapt to the situation.
Yeah, I think, I'm not involved with a lot of the other exhibition planning at the museum, but my understanding is that it's been a pretty similar response, is that we're gonna, temporary shows are gonna stay for longer and still be there when we're able to reopen again. And the Natural History Museum has not reopened at all since it closed last March. There were a few Smithsonian museums that opened for a short time, but ours is in the last of the museums that will reopen, I think, just because of our size. So one thing that was so disappointing is that on March 17th, 2020, we were all set to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the opening of the Hall of Human Origins, and the museum closed a few days before then. So we had great programs planned, and all of those have been postponed. We also have a traveling version of our Hall of Human Origins that spent 2 years going to public libraries across the US. And that was between 2015 and 2017. And then in 2019, we had a pilot where that exhibit traveled to 2 seminaries for several months each. And so we were all set to continue our traveling exhibition program, thinking about applying for funding to continue that. And that had to be on hold because people are not obviously going to libraries either, anywhere like that indoors. The other thing that was frustrating to have to pause in the middle is that I was helping to train a whole new group of volunteers to do public engagement in the Hall of Human Origins. And we were right in the middle of that training. And the last few training sessions that we were planning on doing were things like walking through the exhibit, demonstrating our cart activities, things that really have to be done in person. So that's all on hold, and we've been doing virtual kind of engagement sessions with those volunteers once a month to keep them involved with us. But we have to wait until the museum is ready to reopen again to first finish the training, probably do a little bit of refreshers, and then they'll be able to be, you know, full-fledged volunteers and be out on the exhibit floor. So yeah, there have definitely been things that we've had to put on pause, basically.
At the Morgan, we have reopened. You know, it's a different situation in New York, I think, from Washington. Most museums reopened either in August or in September, even with reduced capacity. So that's a different situation.
Yeah, the Museum of Natural History is open, you know, on a limited basis here in New York as well. So, you know, it's comme ci, comme ça. It's really where you are, location, who's in charge, who's making those decisions, and frankly, how safe your city is. It's so dependent, and here you are, the Morgan, which is a self-contained organization, a beautiful, fine institution, versus the Smithsonian, which is sprawling with multiple museums and very large staffs and so on and so forth. So vaccinations are on the rise. I've had both of mine, Pfizer, yay. Do you think the Morgan will open wider? And when do you think, Briana, if you can talk about it, the Smithsonian Hall of Human Origins might reopen?
I think your guess is as good as mine as to we don't decide. You know, the fact now, I think it's 30% capacity that we are allowed, but this is not decided by us. It's decided, I believe, by the governor. So we have to follow that, and as to when it will be extended, and we don't know. The situation seems to be better in New York, and clearly a lot of people are getting vaccinated, but I really don't know.
Yeah, my answer is similar. There's a really fantastic coronavirus task force at the Smithsonian that's keeping track of local numbers and figuring out, like, we went to phase 2 reopening for staff, which just meant a few more people were allowed to be in the museum on a regular basis, although it's still, I shouldn't make this joke, but it's still kind of a skeleton crew of, you know, collection staff, I know, collection staff that are, you know, checking on the things like the deep freezers, or, you know, checking for leaks, and, you know, building management and security. But the vast majority of us are still required to work from home. And I think it's really gonna, I would say now, you know, for a while we were thinking about maybe when infection rates got lower, but I do think that now it's probably going to be more about vaccination. And I am half Pfizered at the moment. I get my next one in a couple of weeks. So, but I think the Smithsonian General is being very conservative with staff and visitors, and just, you know, very much adhering to safety. So, but as far as the timing, again, like, your guess is as good as mine, because it really depends on external factors.
Right. And then, you know, what happens if these variants and these flare-ups, which can affect, even if as you're planning to reopen, just like the 9 days of the exhibition, everything's going great, we're ready, and then boom,
exactly,
numbers go back up.
There's been a lot of discussions about like moving forward, moving back, and I'm very impressed with the planning. There's really good planning about, you know, when we reopen, it's probably not going to be the entire museum. It's going to be parts of the museum, and there's going to be free timed tickets to make sure that there's only, you know, we're only allowing in, you know, a certain capacity for visitors. And so there's a lot of really good plan. You know, we have a lot of, because it's a natural history museum, there's a lot of interactivity and touchable things. And so how do we deal with that? And how do we clean specimens, and even touch screens and things like that? So there are really good discussions going on about how to make sure that staff feel safe, visitors feel safe, but it's still an enjoyable experience for everybody.
Yeah, I mean, we have, I mean, just the buildings that we're in, you know, a lot of the buildings in CUNY are very old. My, you know, the whole issue of classroom ventilation and workspace ventilation, just as a baseline to when you can fit, you know, so even if they clean everything, what's happening to the circulating air, who's coming in terms of mask mandate, and all this other stuff. So yeah, it's almost like that show from the 1970s, One Day at a Time. We have
Yes.
to take one day at a time, albeit Bonnie Franklin is not with us. But we have to be cautious for ourselves, and frankly, what we bring home to our families as well. If we take it to the micro level rather than the macro level of opening our institutions, has there been anything that was caused by COVID that you hope post-COVID would still be something that you can do?
Yeah, I would hope that in fact this crisis give us a sense that we don't have to be so frantic about the way of doing things. We don't have to travel for meetings all the time. We could just have them on Zoom.
Mm-hmm.
And we can have maybe a somewhat slower pace in changing exhibitions and all of that, because I think the situation has forced us to realize that you can slow down and enjoy more time reading and I mean, personally, I certainly have felt, well, I thought I had to go to all those things, but it turns out I don't have to, I mean, I can't see all the shows in galleries. Well, that's too bad, I'll just, I think there is a certain philosophy maybe that comes out of that we survive with all of those changes. And of course, we want to go back to something, more in the normal that we had before, but I think it had made us realize maybe that some things were not as important as we thought they were, and still continue and function and provide all the services that we are providing, or the pleasure we are providing, etc., to the visitors. And one thing is, I really don't. I don't know if I should say that, but I don't really want to go back to work every day of the week. I'm really hoping to continue sort of mixed, flexible, and spending more time working at home. I think we are more productive anyway.
Yeah, I think our institutions might be realizing this as well. People can get their work done. I mean, you're right that we are missing the element of seeing all our colleagues, both near and far. But if we go back to a hybrid model, where we're in the office 2 or 3 days a week and at home doing work 2 or 3 days a week, I think before the pandemic, it almost felt like you were playing hooky, that, oh, you weren't going to work, you're probably just lounging around, or you're going to the movies, or something. You're definitely not what you should have been doing. But I think what we realize is that we're just as productive at home as we are in our offices and in institutions. Briana, do you want to?
Yeah, I don't have much to add because I agree with all of that, and I'm starting to see, and I like I said, I was working from home one day a week before COVID, and that was my day that I didn't have any meetings because I blocked it off, and it was incredibly productive. And I am heartened to see that, right up to the Secretary of the Smithsonian, Lonnie Bunch, the message has been, we realize that flexibility is important, and that the long-term plan is to make sure. We already had, people had alternate work schedules where they worked 4 10-hour days, and there was a lot of flexibility already. But I think really increasing that, and there are the things I will miss, like I get to have lunch with my family every day, and we get to go on walks in the park near our house, and I don't have a hour commute each way every day. And so that said, I still really miss being with my colleagues. I'm an extrovert, and so I draw energy from other people, so that's been tough. But I am hoping that exactly we have a hybrid model where where some people will be participating on site, some people will be participating off site, and it's just more flexible. And I do really think that that's going to happen.
Yeah, I think so too. I think that's going to be the case for going forward. Certainly in higher education. I mean, we're planning in CUNY, if we do open in the fall, 25% capacity. Classes, instead of meeting 2 days a week, will meet 1 day a week. The other part will be online. So, we're all trying to figure out the new normal.
Yeah.
What will be post-pandemic, and then how long that will last. I mean, if that becomes the new normal, then won't be looking backwards at all. We'll just be looking forwards in terms of this is how we get work done. So on a brighter note, can you talk about any exhibitions that are being planned or programs that are being planned for the future for the post-pandemic world?
Sure. Well, we are planning even during the still pandemic world.
Right. Yes.
We are open, so we are doing exhibitions.
Right.
And in terms of the modern department at the Morgan in June, we are opening an exhibition of the artist Shazia Sikandar, who's a Pakistani-American artist who's done extremely interesting work using the tradition of the manuscript Indo-Persian tradition of manuscript painting and sort of transforming it within by dealing with current issues, feminism, etc. So that will open in June. And in the fall, we are showing a group of drawings that we have acquired just in the past few years from the Souls Grown Deep Foundation, which is a foundation devoted to art made by self-taught Black artists in the South. And so this is something we had planned to do already for a while because we acquired them in the last 3 years. And one exhibition I'm working on, which I'm excited about, which is also based on an acquisition, is when the poet John Ashbery died, soon after that, his husband gave the Morgan a large group of drawings that he owned, made that were usually given to him by other artists. It's about 25 drawings of his collection and artists with whom he was friends, etc. So I'm going to do an exhibition of this group of drawings, and so on Ashbery and his artist friends. So that should be that's an interesting project.
So because we're still closed and we don't have a reopening date, it's hard to plan for when we reopen, when that will be, what that will look like. But certainly there's still exhibition planning underway. We're for the Hall of Human Origins, which I still help to keep updated. We're always thinking about new discoveries where we might need to go in and change things. Hopefully our traveling exhibit will also be able to be restarted. Our curator of globalization, Josh Bell, is right now developing a really fascinating sounding exhibit on cell phones. So there's definitely exhibition planning still happening.
Mm-hmm. So life goes on.
Yeah, exactly.
Life finds a way.
That's right. Adaptable. Exactly.
Have your budgets been impacted or fundraising been impacted? I imagine it may be the case. I know in CUNY, which is so dependent on students, which is so depending on paying students, not just students who show up, but students who actually pay their bills. There are some constraints in public institutions, public-private institutions, and how well we can do our jobs. And while we are working at quote unquote nonprofits, we are impacted by the for-profit world of, having cash flow to keep things going.
Yes, of course, our budget has been heavily impacted because of the lack of earned income, from admissions and also from the rentals of the space, the auditorium, and also our restaurant was closed, etc. So it has been impacted, and fundraising has been more difficult, although we have also created sort of we have been requesting sort of emergency fund, and we also got some from those federal programs to help institutions. So we have weathered it, perhaps better than other museums than the reason that we are a little bit a little bit less reliant on tourism than other museums. So the percentage of our budget from admissions, for instance, is much smaller than it would be at the Guggenheim or MoMA, because we just don't have those mass of tourists who come to visit the Morgan, unfortunately. But
but it's such a beautiful museum and library. As a lifelong New Yorker, I can't think of a year or 6-month period where I haven't visited and just enjoyed every moment of the space. I know it wasn't the Jane Goodall Foundation. It might have been the Leakey Foundation, right before the pandemic, had a wonderful program on human origins at the Morgan that I remember attending, and I remember attending fondly. It was a wonderful program.
So, I can't speak officially necessarily about budgets or anything. My understanding is that we've had a similar impact, not from admissions because we're free, but also from, rental of space for special events, from, the partnership we have with Smithsonian Enterprises for our gift shops and restaurants. And so that certainly has had an impact. A fair proportion of the staff salaries at our museum, at least, come from the federal government, so that hasn't been impacted. A lot of other ones come from private money, so that's often foundation money or endowment money, and so that also hasn't been impacted as much, thankfully, on the staff side. My understanding is that we've also, I think, weathered that storm fairly well, but as we joke in the government, a lot of those financial things are above my pay grade. So.
And yes, I could say the same thing about the Morgan as I said at the Smithsonian, as I say about the Morgan. There isn't a time where I miss the place if I don't go. It's like an itch you have to scratch in both of your institutions. And I serve at the Smithsonian on the Broader Social Impacts Committee for the Hall of Human Origins, and I do miss Briana, seeing you in person, and seeing, of course, Rick, and seeing all of my colleagues there. So I want to thank you both very much for your time and attention. It's been just an absolute delight to hear about your time weathering the storm, how you've both adapted, how your institutions have adapted, and to see both of you being so hopeful and being so able to convey, it's really very nice. Thank you.